What if an entire town of 117 people, including the first English child born in the New World, vanished without a trace? No bodies, no signs of a fight, just a single, cryptic word carved into a post. This is America's oldest and most haunting unsolved mystery.
August 18, 1590. Governor John White stood on the deck of the Hopewell, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. For 3 long, agonizing years, this moment had been his only solace, the single burning hope that had kept him alive. 3 years of fighting indifferent officials in London, of dodging Spanish warships in the Atlantic, of enduring storms that threatened to swallow his ship whole. All for this: to return to his colony, to his daughter Eleanor, and to his granddaughter, Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World. The Outer Banks of North Carolina were a sliver of green and gold on the horizon. As they drew closer to Roanoke Island, White's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He raised his spyglass, his hands trembling. He scanned the shoreline for the familiar sight of the settlement, the sturdy log palisade, the thatched roofs of the cottages, the column of smoke from a communal fire. He saw nothing. An unnatural silence seemed to hang over the island, a silence that even the screeching gulls and the crashing waves could not pierce. When the landing party finally rowed ashore and pushed through the dense curtain of vines into the clearing, the silence became a deafening roar in White's ears. The settlement was gone. Not destroyed, but vanished. The houses had been meticulously dismantled, not burned or smashed. The heavy iron cannons lay half buried in the sand. Weeds choked the small garden plots where his daughter had once tended her herbs. There were no bodies, no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains in the dirt. It was as if all 117 men, women, and children had simply evaporated into the humid air. A frantic search began. His men called out names, their voices swallowed by the oppressive quiet of the forest. Then one of them shouted. Carved deep into one of the main posts of the abandoned palisade was a single, cryptic word, stark and clear in the afternoon sun. Croatoan. He stared at the letters, his mind racing. It was a clue. Before he had left for England 3 years prior, they had agreed on a secret signal. If the colonists were forced to move, they would carve their destination into a tree. If they were in distress, they would carve a Maltese cross above the name. He looked again, his eyes scanning every inch of the wood. There was no cross. They had left, but they had not been in danger. Croatoan. It was the name of a nearby island, home to their only reliable Native American ally, Chief Manteo. A flicker of hope ignited in White's chest. They were alive. They had simply relocated. But as he turned to give the order to sail south to Croatoan, the sky turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The wind began to howl. A hurricane, one of the Outer Banks' infamous furies, was upon them. The storm raged for days, snapping the ship's anchor cable and nearly driving them onto the treacherous shoals. Battered and broken, the captain of the Hopewell refused to risk another landing. His ship and crew were his priority. Over White's desperate, furious protests, they turned the ship east and sailed for home. John White would never see America again. He would die in Ireland, a broken man, haunted by the image of that empty fort and that single, silent word. And so began America's oldest unsolved mystery. What happened to the Lost Colony of Roanoke? The answer is a story of hope, desperation, and a clash of two worlds, a story that faded into the whispers of the forest and the roar of the sea. Part 1. The Seeds of a New World, 1587. 3 years earlier, the same shore had been alive with the sounds of hope. The 117 colonists who landed on Roanoke Island in the summer of 1587 were not soldiers or adventurers seeking gold. They were families, men like Ananias Dare, a tiler and bricklayer, and his wife, Eleanor, John White's daughter. They were carpenters, weavers, and farmers, men and women who had gambled everything on the promise of a new life, a piece of land to call their own, far from the rigid class structure of Elizabethan England. Their governor, John White, was a different kind of leader than the military commanders of previous failed expeditions. He was an artist, a cartographer, a man who saw the New World not as a place to conquer, but as a place of wonder to be documented. His watercolors of the native peoples and the exotic flora and fauna were gentle, observant, and filled with a deep curiosity. But the reality of the New World was far from gentle. Their supplies, damaged during the rough Atlantic crossing, were already dangerously low. The land was swampy and difficult to farm, and they were not alone. This was Algonquian territory, a land inhabited for centuries by a complex network of tribes. Their initial interactions were shaped by two men who represented the two possible paths their future could take, Manteo and Wanchese. Both were influential natives from the region who had been taken to England years earlier. Manteo, from the friendly Croatoan tribe, had returned an Anglophile. He was fascinated by English technology and culture, and he saw an alliance with the colonists as a path to power and prosperity for his people. He was their guide, translator, and advocate. Wanchese, from a rival mainland tribe, had returned from England deeply suspicious. He had seen the dirt and poverty of London, the disease and the arrogance of the English. He saw the colonists not as partners, but as invaders who would take their land and destroy their way of life. He saw the future with a terrifying clarity that Manteo did not. The first few weeks were a tense balance between these two forces. Manteo helped them negotiate for food, while Wanchese's warriors watched them from the shadows of the forest. The colonists, struggling to build their settlement, were on edge. The specter of the first failed military colony, whose men had been massacred after alienating the local tribes, hung over them like a shroud. Then, the fragile peace shattered. A colonist named George Hoe, wading alone in the shallows to catch crabs, was found dead, his body riddled with 16 arrows. It was the work of Wanchese's warriors. Fear turned to paranoia. The colonists, now terrified to leave the safety of their half-finished fort, saw enemies in every rustling leaf.
Amidst this growing dread, a single moment of profound joy occurred. On August 18, 1587, Eleanor Dare gave birth to a daughter. They named her Virginia. She was a symbol of their future, a tiny anchor of hope in a sea of uncertainty. But hope could not fill their empty storehouses. As summer turned to autumn, their situation became desperate. They were running out of food, gunpowder, and tools. They realized they could not survive the coming winter without help. A council was held, and a decision was made. Someone had to return to England on the fleet's only remaining ship to plead for a relief mission. They chose John White. He refused, horrified at the thought of leaving his family. "How can I leave you in this wilderness?" he argued. "My place is here." But the colonists were insistent. He was their governor, Only he had the influence to persuade their backer, Sir Walter Raleigh, and the Queen. For 3 days they pleaded. Finally, with a heavy heart, White relented. He kissed his daughter goodbye and held his infant granddaughter one last time, promising he would return by the following spring. It was a promise he was doomed to break. As his ship sailed away, the colonists stood on the shore, watching until it was a tiny speck on the vast, indifferent ocean. They were now alone, a tiny island of English life in a continent that did not want them. Part 2. The Long Silence, 1587 to 1589. The first winter was a trial by hunger and cold. The meager corn they had managed to trade for was gone by December. Hunting parties returned empty-handed, either because the game was scarce or because they were too afraid to venture far from the fort. The sounds of the forest at night, once a source of wonder, became a symphony of imagined threats. Their only lifeline was Manteo and his Croatoan people. Manteo, now a baptized Christian and officially declared Lord of Roanoke by the English, felt a deep sense of responsibility. He brought them what food he could spare: corn, fish, and dried pumpkins, but it was never enough to feed over 100 mouths. His own people were beginning to murmur. Why should they feed these strange, helpless foreigners? Meanwhile, Wanchese's hostility grew. He saw the colonists' weakness as an opportunity. His warriors conducted lightning raids, stealing tools and setting fire to the forest perimeter. They never launched a full-scale attack. Instead, they waged a war of attrition, a campaign of terror designed to break the colonists' spirit. By the spring of 1588, the time John White had promised to return, all eyes were turned eastward, desperately scanning the horizon for the sight of English sails. Every morning they woke with a flicker of hope. Every evening they went to sleep with a fresh wave of despair. Spring turned to summer, and the sea remained empty. Their society began to fray. The strictures of English life seemed absurd in this desperate wilderness. Their woolen clothes rotted in the humidity, replaced by patched-together deerskin. The blacksmith's forge fell silent, his supply of coal exhausted. When a tool broke, it could not be replaced. They were a 16th-century people, slowly, painfully regressing. Divisions grew within the community. One faction, led by a hot-headed man named Simon Fernandine, argued for a preemptive strike against Wanchese. He bellowed, "We must show them English steel, or they will pick us off one by one." Another faction, led by Eleanor Dare, argued for a different path. She had spent time with Manteo's people and saw the wisdom in their ways. "Our steel is useless if our bellies are empty. We cannot fight and starve at the same time. Our only hope is to leave this cursed island and ask Manteo for sanctuary. We must go to Croatoan." The debate raged for months. To abandon the settlement felt like an admission of failure. It meant giving up on the life they had crossed an ocean to build. It meant giving up on John White's return. The tipping point came in the late autumn of 1588. A hunting party, driven by desperation, ventured too far and was ambushed. Only one man returned, bleeding and hysterical, telling of a brutal attack by Wanchese's warriors. The attack had been a message. Wanchese was done waiting. That night, a decision was made. They would abandon Roanoke. They were no longer English settlers waiting for rescue. They were survivors. They meticulously dismantled their houses, packing away every nail, every plank, every tool they could carry. They buried their heavy cannons, hoping one day to return for them. And on the main palisade post,
One of the men carefully carved the 7 letters that would become their final message to the world. Croatoan. They did not carve a cross. They were leaving not in panic, but with a plan. They were a colony on the move, marching toward their last and only hope. Part 3. The Fading Echo. While his colony fought for survival, John White was trapped in his own nightmare. He arrived in an England consumed by war. King Philip II of Spain had launched his Invincible Armada, a massive fleet sent to conquer England. Every available English ship, including the one he had contracted for his relief mission, was commandeered for the war effort. He pleaded, begged, and lobbied, but it was useless. The fate of 100 settlers in a distant wilderness was nothing compared to the threat of a Spanish invasion. For 2 years he was powerless, a frantic father trapped by the gears of history. It wasn't until 1590 that he finally secured passage back, not on a dedicated supply mission, but by hitching a ride with a fleet of privateers more interested in raiding Spanish ships than in rescuing colonists. The cruel irony of his story is that he came so close. After finding the message and the empty fort, he was ready to sail the short distance to Croatoan. He was only 50 miles away from a possible reunion, from an answer. But the hurricane, a random act of nature, sealed his family's fate forever. He was forced to retreat, leaving the mystery unsolved. So what happened after the colonists reached Croatoan Island? No one knows for certain, but history and local tradition offer a compelling theory. They were likely taken in by Manteo's people. In that small, isolated community, the two groups would have had to merge to survive. The English, with their last remaining tools and knowledge of metalworking, would have been valuable assets. The Croatoan, with their deep understanding of the land and sea, would have been essential teachers. Over the years, the lines would have blurred. English blood would have mixed with Algonquin. The children of the colonists would have grown up speaking a mixture of languages, their English memories fading with each passing season. They would have learned to fish with weirs, to hunt with bows, and to read the language of the sky and the tides. Virginia Dare would have become a woman of 2 worlds, her true identity perhaps forgotten even to herself. Evidence of this assimilation exists. Over a century later, another English explorer, John Lawson, visited Hatteras Island, the modern name for Croatoan. He noted that many of the natives there had gray eyes and lighter hair, features unheard of in other tribes. He also wrote that they recounted stories of ancestors who could speak in a book. The most powerful clue lies with the Lumbee people of North Carolina. For centuries, this large and proud tribe has passed down an oral tradition that they are the descendants of the Roanoke colonists who merged with a local tribe. Dozens of surnames found on the original Lost Colony muster roll, Dare, Stevens, Cooper, Powell, have existed within the Lumbee community for as long as anyone can remember. The Lumbee story is a powerful claim to a dual heritage, a living link to America's first great mystery. The Lost Colony of Roanoke is not a story of failure, but of transformation. It is the story of a group of people who were abandoned by their world and forced to create a new one. They did not vanish, they were absorbed. Their English identity was washed away by the tides of a new continent, leaving behind only a single haunting word carved into a wooden post. Virginia Dare became a legend, a ghost of an English beginning that was lost before it could truly start. But perhaps her real legacy is not as a ghost, but as